Dr. Victor Sterling was a legend within the medical community, a man whose hands were said to possess the divine touch of salvation. At St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, his success rate was an impossible 100%, a statistic that defied the chaotic nature of emergency surgery. Wealthy elites from across the country flew in specifically for his care, trusting him with their lives without hesitation. The operating theaters where he worked were always kept at a freezing temperature, preserved like shrines dedicated to a god of medicine. Nurses whispered that he never slept, often seen pacing the halls during the deepest hours of the night. There were rumors that he made deals with forces beyond understanding to keep his patients breathing. The hospital administration protected his privacy fiercely, denying all requests for interviews regarding his techniques. Patients who went under his knife never died, but some claimed they felt a cold presence watching them during anesthesia. The perfection of his work was too clean, too precise, lacking the natural messiness of human biology. Something unnatural fueled his success, hidden behind the sterile white walls of the surgical wing. Emily Carter, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption, arrived at the hospital under the guise of writing a feature on medical miracles. She had spent months tracking a disturbing pattern involving sudden deaths in the emergency room that coincided perfectly with Sterling's scheduled surgeries. Her research indicated that whenever a wealthy client required a heart or kidney, an unrelated donor with matching blood type died mysteriously nearby. These donors were often homeless individuals or unclaimed bodies brought in by ambulances after strange accidents. Emily compiled a list of over 50 such cases, all occurring within a 48-hour window of Sterling's operations. She felt a chill every time she connected another name on her list to a surviving billionaire. The data suggested a supply chain of human parts that operated outside legal boundaries. She checked into a nearby hotel, keeping her notes encrypted on a secure drive hidden in her luggage. Every time she walked past the hospital, she felt eyes watching her from the upper windows. She knew she was close to uncovering a conspiracy that could bring down the entire medical institution. During her second day, Emily managed to gain access to the records room by flashing a forged press badge to the tired night clerk. The files were older than expected, some dating back decades, all stored in dusty boxes beneath the main server room. She found discrepancies in the time of death records, where timestamps had been manually altered to match the availability of organs. In one specific case, a donor was declared dead minutes before Sterling began an incision, yet the transport time made no logical sense. The paperwork smelled of formaldehyde and old paper, triggering a headache that pulsed behind her eyes. She noticed that certain files were marked with a specific red symbol that looked like a surgical scalpel. Her hands shook as she photographed the evidence, knowing that possession of these documents could be dangerous. The silence in the archives was heavy, broken only by the hum of the cooling units. She felt a sudden draft, though the windows were sealed tight. Someone else was in the room with her, breathing softly in the darkness behind the stacks. Dr. Sterling invited Emily to his office for an official interview, his smile warm but not reaching his cold, gray eyes. The office was decorated with awards and photos of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities who owed him their lives. He offered her coffee from a private pot, watching her closely as she took the cup. He spoke eloquently about the burden of saving lives and the sacrifices required to maintain excellence in medicine. Emily noticed a keycard on his desk that lacked any hospital branding, marked only with a basement-level indicator. He caught her looking at it and slid it into his pocket without breaking his sentence. The conversation shifted to the nature of death, with Sterling arguing that death was merely a resource management issue. He suggested that some lives were worth more than others, a philosophy that made Emily's skin crawl. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the elevator personally, pressing the button for her with a gloved hand. The doors closed slowly, and she saw him standing there still watching until the metal slid shut. Curiosity got the better of Emily, and she returned to the hospital late that night using a duplicate key she had lifted from his office coat. The corridors were empty, the lighting dimmed to a ghostly blue hue that cast long shadows against the tiles. She found the service elevator behind a locked maintenance door that she picked with a tension wrench. The elevator descended past the known basement levels, digging deeper into the earth than the building schematics allowed. The air grew colder with each floor, carrying a scent of antiseptic mixed with something copper and sweet like old blood. The elevator chimed softly as it stopped at a level labeled B4, which did not exist on any public map. The doors opened to a hallway lined with thick glass windows looking into dark rooms. She could hear the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoing from behind the walls. Her flashlight beam flickered as she stepped out, the battery draining faster than usual in this damp environment. She knew she had found the heart of the mystery, and it was beating slowly in the dark. Emily moved silently down the corridor, peering through the glass into the rooms that lined the hidden basement level. Inside, she saw rows of hospital beds occupied by people who were clearly alive but deeply sedated. Tubes ran from their arms to large machines that filtered their blood and kept their organs functioning at peak performance. Each bed had a tag hanging from the footboard listing blood type, organ health, and compatibility status. These were not patients being treated. They were livestock being kept fresh for harvest. She recognized one face from a missing persons poster she had seen during her research weeks ago. The horror of the realization hit her like a physical blow, making her stomach turn violently. She covered her mouth to stifle a gasp, tears forming in her eyes at the sheer scale of the operation. The machines hummed in unison, a mechanical choir sustaining life against will. She realized Sterling wasn't just finding donors. He was farming them in the dark beneath the city. She needed to get out and call the police immediately before she was discovered. As she turned to leave, the lights in the corridor flared bright white, blinding her momentarily as the security system activated. A voice spoke over the intercom, calm and recognizable as Dr. Sterling, telling her that visitors were not allowed in the preservation wing. The heavy steel doors at the end of the hall slammed shut, locking her inside with the sleeping donors. She ran back towards the elevator, but the buttons were unresponsive. The system locked down from the control room. Shadows seemed to detach themselves from the walls, forming into orderly lies wearing masks who stepped out from the darkness. They moved with synchronized precision, blocking her path without speaking a single word. Emily pulled out her pepper spray, but the figures did not flinch, advancing steadily towards her position. She screamed for help, but the soundproofing of the basement absorbed her voice completely. The beeping of the monitors grew louder, accelerating as if reacting to her fear. She was trapped in a tomb of living bodies, surrounded by the very evidence she sought to expose. Dr. Sterling emerged from the shadows at the end of the hall, wearing a fresh surgical gown and holding a tray of sterile instruments. He looked disappointed rather than angry, shaking his head as if she were a child who had broken a rule. He explained that his work was necessary to save the minds that shaped the world, using the bodies of those who contributed nothing. He viewed himself as a gardener pruning the weak to allow the strong to flourish without disease. Emily argued that every life had value, but Sterling laughed softly, checking the compatibility chart on her file, which he had pulled from his pocket. He revealed that he had known she was investigating from the start, and had tested her blood during their coffee meeting earlier that day. She was a universal donor, a rare find that he could not let walk away from the facility. The orderlies grabbed her arms, their grip like iron bands that crushed any hope of resistance. She struggled wildly, kicking and biting, but they dragged her towards an empty bed prepared with fresh restraints. They strapped her down to the cold metal table, the leather cuffs biting into her wrists as she screamed until her throat was raw. Sterling adjusted the overhead lights, focusing the beam directly into her dilated pupils while he prepared the anesthesia. He told her not to worry, promising that she would become part of something greater than her individual existence. The needle entered her vein, sending a cold fire spreading through her limbs as her motor functions began to fail. She watched him select a scalpel, the steel gleaming under the harsh surgical lights of the underground chamber. Her vision began to blur, the edges of the room fading into a gray fog of unconsciousness. The last thing she saw was Sterling washing his hands in a sink nearby, humming a gentle tune as he prepared for the incision. The heart monitor beside her began to beep steadily, marking the final moments of her freedom. The darkness closed in, not as an end, but as a transition into inventory. The next morning, St. Jude's Hospital issued a statement that Emily Carter had left the city abruptly after completing her article, citing personal reasons. Dr. Sterling performed a successful transplant on a senator that afternoon, receiving another standing ovation from the medical board. In the basement level before, a new tag was hung on a bed where the machines continued to hum softly in the dark. The system remained intact, protected by the wealth and power of those who benefited from the spare parts supply. Emily's article was never published, and her notes disappeared from her hotel room without a trace. Sterling walked through the wards, checking on his patients with the same serene expression he always wore. The cycle of life and death continued according to his design, hidden beneath the floors of the healing center. No one questioned the perfect success rate anymore, accepting the miracles as facts of modern science. The hospital remained a beacon of hope, built on a foundation of silent screams and stolen lives. Somewhere in the dark, a monitor beeped rhythmically, waiting for the next call to harvest. The morgue at St. Luke's Hospital was a place where silence held more weight than the screams heard in the emergency ward above. Mark, a new attendant assigned to the night shift, felt the chill of the refrigerated units seeping into his bones despite the heavy coat he wore. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently like a dying heartbeat that matched the rhythm of his own anxiety. He was responsible for logging every body that arrived, ensuring the toe tags matched the records perfectly without error. On his third night, he noticed a discrepancy in the logbook that made his stomach turn with unease. A body listed as John Doe had been moved to a different drawer without his authorization or knowledge. The metal shelves groaned softly in the background, sounding like whispers from the deceased resting within the cold steel compartments. Mark told himself it was a simple administrative mistake, but the air smelled sharper than usual, tinged with a metallic scent that reminded him of fresh blood rather than preserved remains. He walked down the row of drawers, his footsteps echoing loudly on the tiled floor, feeling an unseen presence watching him from the shadows behind the storage units. The temperature seemed to drop further as he approached the last row, where the oldest bodies were kept in permanent storage. Mark pulled the handle of drawer 4, expecting to see the elderly woman he had processed earlier that evening. Instead, he found a young man with a wound on his chest that was not recorded in the initial intake report. The toe tag dangling from the cold digit bore the name of the elderly woman, swapped meticulously to hide the discrepancy. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the skin, which felt unnaturally warm for a corpse that had been in refrigeration for hours. He checked the next drawer, and the next, finding that every single identity tag had been switched among the 5 bodies currently in storage. It was as if someone was playing a grotesque game of mix and match with the dead, erasing their identities for a sinister purpose. The silence of the room became oppressive, pressing against his eardrums until he could hear the blood rushing in his own veins. He realized that this was not a mistake but a deliberate act of manipulation by someone who had access to the secure facility. Mark backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen and shift against the white walls. He knew he was not alone in the morgue, and the dead were not the only things hiding in the cold. A soft shuffling sound came from behind the large autopsy table, causing Mark to spin around with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing was there except the stainless steel instruments hanging on the wall, gleaming like sharp teeth in the dim light. He convinced himself it was the building settling, but the hair on his arms stood up in response to a primal warning signal. He decided to check the security footage, walking towards the small monitoring office tucked away in the corner of the morgue. The screens were static, filled with gray noise that obscured the view of the main storage area completely. When he tapped the monitor, the image flickered to life for a second, showing a figure standing over the open drawers before the feed cut out again. The figure was wearing a morgue attendant uniform identical to the one Mark was currently wearing. Panic began to rise in his throat as he realized the intruder was not just hiding but impersonating the staff to move freely. He locked the office door behind him, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps that fogged the small window. The handle began to turn slowly from the outside, testing the lock with a patience that suggested the person on the other side was in no hurry. The next morning, the hospital was in chaos because a senior nurse had vanished without a trace during her shift. Mark tried to report the swap tags to the security chief, but he was dismissed as a nervous rookie imagining things in the creepy basement. Later, he found the nurse's ID badge lying on the floor of the morgue near the drain where the blood was washed away. The plastic was cracked, suggesting a struggle had taken place right beneath the feet of the dead. He picked it up, noticing fresh scratches on the surface that looked like they were made by fingernails desperate to escape. The realization hit him that the killer was not just swapping tags but removing people entirely to take their place within the hospital system. He looked at the staff roster on the wall, seeing faces of people he worked with every day without truly knowing them. Any one of them could be the imposter wearing a stolen life like an ill-fitting suit. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, sounding like angry insects swarming around his head. He felt a sudden urge to run, but his legs felt heavy as if the cold floor was grabbing hold of his ankles to keep him there. Mark decided to stay late again, hiding inside one of the empty body storage drawers to watch what happened when the lights went out. The interior was cramped and smelled of stale air and cleaning chemicals, claustrophobic enough to make anyone panic. He left the lid slightly ajar, peering through the crack into the dimly lit room where the shadows stretched long across the tiles. Hours passed in silence until the clock struck 3, the witching hour when the hospital seemed to hold its breath. The main lights died completely, leaving only the emergency red glow that cast everything in a bloody hue. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a fluid grace that was unnatural for a human walking on tiled floors. It was wearing a surgeon's coat, but the face was obscured by a surgical mask stained with dark fluids. The figure began to open the drawers, checking the tags inside with a methodical precision that sent shivers down Mark's spine. It stopped at the drawer where Mark was hiding, the cold metal vibrating slightly as the hand rested on the handle. Mark held his breath, praying the latch would hold against the intruder's inspection. The handle was pulled down, and the drawer slid open inches, revealing Mark's terrified eyes staring back at the intruder. The figure did not scream or react with surprise. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying a specimen in a lab. Mark kicked out wildly, slamming the drawer shut with all his strength before scrambling out of the adjacent unit to escape. The figure moved faster than any human should, reaching for him with hands that were too long and pale. Mark sprinted towards the exit, but the electronic lock had been disabled, trapping them both inside the cold storage facility. He grabbed a heavy bone saw from the autopsy table, wielding it like a weapon against the pursuing shadow. The figure laughed, a sound that was muffled by the mask but still carried a menacing tone of amusement. It spoke in a voice that sounded like multiple people talking at once, claiming that identities were just shells to be worn and discarded. Mark realized this was not a normal killer but something that fed on the essence of the people it eliminated. The temperature dropped so low that his breath froze in the air, creating a mist that hid the figure from view momentarily. Mark hid behind a stack of clean sheets, watching as the figure peeled off the surgical mask to reveal a face that was shifting and changing features. It looked like the missing nurse for a moment, then morphed into the face of the security chief he had spoken to earlier. The skin rippled like water, unable to hold a single form stable for more than a few seconds. This confirmed his worst fear that the killer was stealing identities literally, not just wearing uniforms to blend in. He understood now why the toe tags were swapped. The killer was practicing on the dead before moving on to the living staff members. Mark needed to find a way to override the lockout on the doors before he became the next victim in the sequence. He crawled towards the electrical panel on the wall, trying to bypass the security system while the figure searched for him. The lights flickered violently as he tampered with the wires, sparks flying onto the floor near his hands. He managed to restore power to the exit, but the noise alerted the figure to his location immediately. The creature turned, its face now settling into a grotesque mimicry of Mark's own face. The creature wore Mark's face now, smiling with his mouth, but with eyes that remained completely black and devoid of soul. It walked towards him casually, no longer hunting but stalking with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Mark realized that if he escaped, No one would believe him because the killer could look exactly like him to the outside world. He had to destroy the evidence before leaving, grabbing the logbook and the security drive to prove the swaps had occurred. The creature spoke with Mark's voice, telling him that it was too late to change the outcome of the night. It claimed that the hospital was a farm for identities, harvesting lives to sustain its own existence over the decades. Mark threw a canister of formaldehyde at the creature, causing it to hiss as the chemicals burned its shifting skin. He used the distraction to burst through the exit door, running up the stairs towards the main lobby where people were safe. He screamed for help, but the staff he encountered looked at him with confusion because the other Mark was already upstairs signing paperwork. Security guards surrounded Mark, pointing their weapons at him while the imposter stood calmly beside the chief of staff. The imposter pointed at Mark, labeling him as the unstable employee who had hallucinated the entire incident. Mark tried to show the logbook, but the pages were blank, the ink having vanished as if by magic. He looked at the gurney being wheeled towards the ambulance bay, covered by a white sheet with a toe tag sticking out. He recognized the shoes beneath the sheet as the ones the imposter was wearing earlier. The killer was escaping by pretending to be a corpse being transferred to another facility for autopsy. Mark broke free from the guards, running towards the gurney to pull back the sheet and reveal the truth to everyone. The imposter lunged at him from the side, tackling him to the ground before he could expose the body bag. They struggled on the cold pavement, the imposter's strength overwhelming as it tried to drag Mark towards the ambulance. The drivers looked on impassively, as if they were part of the conspiracy to move the dead without questions. The ambulance doors slammed shut with Mark locked inside alongside the body bag and the imposter who had now shifted forms again. The vehicle sped away from the hospital, sirens wailing not to clear traffic but to signal a departure that could not be stopped. Inside the dark back of the ambulance, Mark realized he was now the one being transferred to an unknown destination. The imposter sat across from him, wiping Mark's face off its own skin like wet paint to reveal a new identity underneath. Mark screamed until his voice gave out, but the glass partition separated him from the driver who ignored his pleas. The hospital remained unchanged the next day, with a new attendant hired to replace Mark who was listed as resigned. The morgue drawers were full again, each tag correctly labeled according to the new records kept by the imposter. Patients continued to die and disappear, their identities harvested to keep the facility running smoothly without scrutiny. The cycle continued in the silence of the basement, where the dead wore the faces of the living. No one questioned the perfect efficiency of the morgue staff anymore, fearing they might be next on the list for transfer. Nurse Sarah walked through the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital with a quiet grace that unsettled even the seasoned staff members. Her white uniform was always immaculate, devoid of any stains, despite the chaotic nature of the emergency ward where she worked tirelessly every night. Patients loved her gentle touch and soothing voice, often requesting her specifically during their most vulnerable nights of pain. She was known as the Angel of Mercy, a title bestowed upon her by grateful families who believed she possessed a supernatural ability to ease suffering. However, beneath her calm exterior lay a cold calculation that no one dared to question openly. The mortality rate in her wing was unusually low, a statistic that brought immense prestige and extra funding to the hospital administration annually. They turned a blind eye to the peculiar timing of deaths, preferring the financial stability her reputation provided over strict investigations. Sarah believed she was doing God's work, removing suffering before it could take root in the souls of the dying patients. But lately, her definition of suffering had expanded beyond the terminally ill to include anyone who caught her mysterious, unblinking gaze. The hospital lights flickered occasionally as she passed, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her syringe. Dr. Ahmed, a new intern assigned to the night shift, noticed a disturbing pattern within the first week of his rotation. He observed that patients who were showing signs of recovery suddenly deteriorated after Sarah administered their evening medication. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, attributing the deaths to underlying conditions that were not visible on the surface charts. However, the frequency of these incidents was too high to ignore, occurring almost like clockwork whenever Sarah was on duty. He began to keep a secret log of every patient she treated, noting the exact time of injection and the subsequent vital signs. The data revealed a chilling correlation that made his blood run cold during the quiet hours of the night. Ahmed tried to discuss his findings with the senior staff, but they quickly changed the subject or warned him about respecting hierarchy. The atmosphere in the break room grew tense whenever he entered, as if everyone knew a secret they were sworn to protect. He felt isolated within the bustling hospital, surrounded by people who smiled but watched him with suspicious eyes. One night, he decided to follow her discreetly, hiding behind the linen carts to witness her routine firsthand. Ahmed watched from the shadows as Sarah entered the room of a young man who was scheduled for discharge the following morning. The patient was smiling, talking on the phone with his family, clearly healthy and full of hope for the future. Sarah approached the bed with her usual serene smile, preparing a syringe that glinted under the dim fluorescent lights of the ward. Ahmed expected her to administer vitamins or standard painkillers, but the label on the vial was obscured by her thumb. She spoke softly to the patient, whispering words that sounded like a blessing rather than medical instructions. The young man nodded calmly, trusting her completely, before closing his eyes to rest. Within minutes, his breathing slowed drastically, and the monitor began to flatline despite his previous stability. Sarah did not panic. Instead, she adjusted the 4-drip calmly and marked the time of death on her clipboard with steady hands. Ahmed felt a surge of nausea, realizing that this was not negligence but a deliberate act of murder disguised as care. He retreated quietly, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird seeking escape. The next day, Ahmed confronted Sarah in the empty supply closet, demanding to know why she had killed a healthy patient. She did not deny the accusation. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that seemed devoid of any human empathy or remorse. She explained that she could see the darkness waiting in their futures, an inevitable suffering that she was mercifully preventing before it began. To her, death was not an end but a gift, a way to spare souls from the torment of life's inevitable tragedies. Ahmed argued that she had no right to play God or decide who deserved to live based on her visions. Sarah laughed softly, a sound that echoed eerily in the small room filled with medical supplies. She told him that the administration knew everything and approved of her methods because results mattered more than ethics in their world. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, holding a new syringe filled with a clear liquid. Ahmed realized too late that he had made himself a target by knowing too much about her secret operations. The door locked automatically behind him, sealing him inside with the Angel of Mercy. Panic surged through Ahmed as he rattled the locked door, realizing he was trapped alone with the killer nurse. Sarah moved towards him slowly, her movements fluid and predatory like a stalking cat in the dim light. She explained that new staff members often struggled to understand the greater purpose of her work until it was too late for them. The hospital administration protected her because she kept the costs low and the success rates artificially high for marketing purposes. Ahmed backed away until he hit the shelves of sterile equipment, knocking down boxes that clattered loudly on the tiled floor. He screamed for help, but the soundproof walls of the supply closet muffled his voice effectively. Sarah raised the syringe, her expression shifting from serene to something grotesque and hungry for completion. She claimed that he saw too much darkness himself and needed to be saved from his own curious nature. Ahmed grabbed a heavy metal tray to defend himself, throwing it at her to create a distraction. He managed to slip past her when she ducked, bursting out into the corridor where the lights were flickering violently. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, the lights buzzing like angry insects overhead as he ran for the nurse's station. He expected to find security or other doctors, but the hallway was eerily deserted despite the usual night shift activity. Every door he passed seemed to be locked, and the emergency exits refused to open when he pushed the bars. Sarah's voice echoed over the intercom system, calm and soothing, telling him to stop running and accept his fate peacefully. He realized that the entire hospital wing might be compromised, with staff members either involved or too afraid to intervene. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to move independently, reaching out to grab his ankles as he sprinted. He found a fire axe mounted on the wall and broke the glass to arm himself against the pursuing nurse. The temperature dropped significantly, causing his breath to visible in the air despite the clinical heating system. He heard her footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, knowing that she had all the time in the world. The hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a labyrinth designed for hunting prey. Ahmed barricaded himself inside the records room, searching for evidence to expose Sarah and the administration's complicity. He found files labeled mercy cases, containing photos of patients who were healthy before their sudden, unexplained deaths under her care. Each file included a handwritten note from Sarah describing the specific darkness she claimed to see in their souls. The notes were written in a strange script that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly from the corner of his eye. He realized that her power might not be entirely human, suggesting a supernatural entity was guiding her hand during the injections. The computer terminal flickered on its own, displaying a live feed of the room he was currently hiding inside. Sarah appeared on the screen, standing right outside the door, smiling warmly as if she were watching a beloved child play. The door handle began to turn slowly, despite the lock being engaged from the inside. Ahmed knew he had only minutes before she entered, so he downloaded the files to a USB drive hidden in his pocket. The door burst open with a force that shattered the lock, sending wood splinters flying across the small room like shrapnel. Sarah stood in the doorway, but her appearance had changed. Her uniform was stained with old blood, and her eyes were completely black. She floated slightly above the ground, moving towards him without touching the floor tiles. Ahmed swung the fire axe wildly, but it passed through her as if she were made of smoke or mist. She laughed, a sound that vibrated in his chest, causing pain radiating from his heart. She told him that physical weapons were useless against what she had become through years of collecting souls. The lights in the room exploded, showering them with glass shards that cut Ahmed's face and hands. He stumbled backward, dropping the USB drive as he fell over a stack of old medical journals. Sarah picked up the drive and crushed it easily in her hand, sparks flying from her fingers. She told him that the truth would die with him, just like all the other patients who tried to resist her mercy. Ahmed tried to crawl towards the window, hoping to break it and scream for help from the street below. Sarah grabbed him by the ankle, her grip feeling like ice burning his skin through his pants. He kicked desperately, but her strength was supernatural, dragging him back across the floor towards the corner. The shadows in the room coalesced into shapes resembling the patients she had killed, watching silently from the walls. They whispered his name, urging him to accept the peace that Sarah was offering so generously. He felt his consciousness fading as she injected him with the remaining liquid from her syringe. The pain was instantaneous, followed by a strange sense of calm that washed over his terrified mind. He looked up at her one last time, seeing not a monster, but a savior in his drugged state. His vision blurred, and the last thing he heard was the sound of the heart monitor flatlining in the distance. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator storing the deadly medications. The next morning, the hospital administration announced that Dr. Ahmed had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest during his night shift. Sarah stood beside his covered body, wiping a tear from her eye for the cameras and grieving family. She was praised for her heroic efforts to revive him, despite the unfortunate outcome that no one could have prevented. The files he found were gone, replaced by falsified records stating he had a pre-existing heart condition unknown to anyone. The mortality rates remained low, and the funding continued to pour into St. Mary's Hospital without interruption. Sarah walked back to her station, preparing another syringe for the next patient on her list. She looked at the new intern arriving for the day shift, smiling with that same unsettling grace. The cycle continued, hidden behind the white walls and the promise of healing that masked the horror within. Patients came to get better, but some left forever, saved from a darkness only she could see. The hospital remained a place of miracles, built on a foundation of silent graves and merciful deaths. No one ever questioned the perfect statistics again.